Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us again. We are back, and we're back to talk about cybersecurity here at the POLITICO Pub at the Rosewood Hotel at the Munich Security Conference that's kicked off this morning. I'm Laurens Cerulus. I'm Politico's cybersecurity editor in Europe. And I'm going to be spending the next 20 minutes to talk about cybersecurity in depth. So we'll talk about cybersecurity, cyber defense, cybercrime as a Cyber Insights briefing session for today's program. To do so, I have the absolute pleasure of having Chris Krebs with me. For those who are in cyber, you know who Chris Krebs is. Chris is one of the most renowned cybersecurity experts and former official at CISA in the United States. Currently Chief Intelligence and Public Policy Officer at SentinelOne. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you with me. Thank you so much for joining us for the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks to Politico.
I hear you you came in this morning, so how's your landing into Munich been so far?
I got my 30-minute power nap, so a little bit of coffee, and I'm good to go for at least another few hours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So when we talk about cybersecurity, obviously the Munich Security Conference is going. It's a very peculiar couple of days that we're having here because there's so much moving at the time that we are having discussions, and so it will be really interesting to see. What is clear is that the discussion on technology and on cybersecurity is one that is sort of across the board. Sort of a looming element. It's an issue that is always lurking in the background of security tensions and conflict, and it is one where we continue to sort of grapple with its importance and with its impact on what we're seeing in geopolitics today. You're very close to it from an analyst and a threat intelligence perspective, and so I really want to start where a lot of the discussions around cybersecurity have been around in the last couple of weeks and months, which is that we've seen new threats, we've seen a changing threat landscape. I'm referring to the attacks that we've seen, or the intrusions that we've seen of global telecommunications providers across the world by groups such as Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, etc. And this is really a new element that we're seeing, and where we see Western governments sort of grappling with how to respond to this. Can you just talk us through what exactly has been going on, both within the threat intelligence community and the policy community in the past couple of months in response to this?
Yeah, so the way I see it, Chinese cyber, Chinese hacking is or should be one of the most talked about topics, certainly in the US, but I think in Europe as well. And that should have been over the last year and a half, 18 months to 2 years. And I said it several times through the last US election. If not for the US election, the number one thing we would all be talking about, or at least should be talking about, is Chinese hacking of the telecoms, Chinese hacking of critical infrastructure. And there are a few reasons for that. But I do kind of want to go back to one of your setup comments, the fact that we're sitting here in the Rosewood as opposed to the Bayer Rischerhof and talking cyber. And that has been my experience now for half a decade plus. Cyber is tangential, as you mentioned. It's kind of lurking in the shadows, but it's not main stage. We are getting to the point where it has to be main stage because of the increase of threats that you just mentioned. So to kind of break down what's happening big picture, about 2 years ago, Microsoft released a report about a group known as Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon is their internal code name for the Chinese PLA, the military. It's their hacking group, and they were discovered hacking into 2 separate types or profiles of targets. The first was natural, military targets. So US bases in Hawaii, bases on the West Coast, Guam, and elsewhere. The second profile of targets was much more concerning and less natural. And it's also appropriate that you had Ann Neuberger up here, because she was one of the ones who was really raising the alarm here. But that second profile was just civilian critical infrastructure that didn't fit a very clear strategic objective of, for instance, a port on the West Coast. there were water facilities in the middle of the United States that had no military objective. And so when you break it down and you look a little bit harder, what comes to light is that the targeting unveils the fact that the Chinese do not separate military and civilian targets. It's all part of the broader objective. That they also, in addition to disrupting critical infrastructure from an operational perspective, they also want a separate outcome of societal chaos, societal panic, and yes, perhaps even loss of life. And the concept is, and this is not just my assessment, this is from the Central Intelligence Agency, the deputy director and the director in the last administration both said that President Xi had directed his military to give him the option, the capability to invade Taiwan by 2027. Again, that's the CIA's assessment, not mine. And whether they actually do that, I don't know if the political decision has been made, but nonetheless, the idea is that they want to win that invasion before the ships start rolling across the Strait of Taiwan. One way they would do that is not just hit military targets for the US, but they would hit civilian targets so that the population, civilians, are suffering in the midst of this event. That they are demanding political leadership say, hey, take care of me. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about the island over there. Get my water back on, get my lights back on, get my groceries back on the shelves at the supermarket. So that plan is part of the Chinese strategy. Now, there's a second element of this, in addition to the military side, and that's the Salt Typhoon campaign that you mentioned, going after telecommunications. Salt Typhoon is the Ministry of State Security. That is their equivalent of their espionage or their security service. So what they've done over the last couple of years is just use some of those vulnerabilities and systems that Anne was talking about to be able to walk into all the major telecommunications providers in the United States, and yes, here in Europe as well. Over the last month or so, it's come to light that there have been additional victims of nation level, national level telecommunications provider. This is just espionage, though, and that's the key differentiator.
Do you see, how does that translate into the response that we've seen? Because indeed, there's been a very active discussion in the United States, roughly for a couple past months since the quarter four of 2024 around this topic. And in Europe, that conversation around how do we respond to this, how do we deal with this cyber espionage threat that is clearly out there and present, it has been much less active. Why? Do you have an explanation for that?
Well, I think it's proximity, and I think it's also experience. And again, on the Volt Typhoon, again, the Volt Typhoon is the military. And this is one issue I think as a security community we have to resolve using code names, which mystifies the adversary. We need to really get down to brass tacks, call them what they are, if we want to resonate with the business community and with the just the general population. Call it what it is: Chinese military, Chinese spying. Chinese military that was detected 2.5 years ago, I think that set the stage, at least in the security community and across the business community. And then you pile on top the spying across the networks, the telecommunication networks, including the Vice President of the United States, the now Vice President, then the candidate. One of his phones was compromised by the Chinese. So it really resonated in the halls of power as well as across the business community. I don't know if we have that same level of resonance here in Europe, but I will say this: in my travels, Australia in December, London last month, again, the security services are entirely on board and they are working with the business community. The question is whether we're doing enough on the cybersecurity defenses to harden systems, protect the systems, to keep the Chinese hackers out.
So on the element of, that's China. And on the element of Russia, I think we do have seen a much more active discussion in Europe. There's also a very active threat in NATO's eastern flank. And we're also seeing things like hybrid campaigns play out all across Europe right now. You were very close to the presidential election in 2020. That was one of the reasons why current president Donald Trump and President then asked you to leave office, or fired you, as we may say.
I was trying to figure out how you were going to land that, but yes.
So my question is, from your experience on election integrity and election security, with what you're seeing play out in Europe right now, Germany is having its election this month. How confident can we be that there is resilience, that there is the response mechanisms in place to actually hold fair elections?
So I think this is one of the things that's come to light over the last decade. And again, taking a very US-centric approach, the 2016 election and the Russian interference and influence campaigns that were rolled out across the 2016 election, it became apparent that our adversaries understood that there were technical systems that they could go after that frankly didn't yield much satisfaction. They were not really able to do much from hacking into election systems in the US and get any outcome. They weren't able to change votes. It's very, very hard, distributed systems. But where they have seen they can get some traction and some purchase and some progress is going after this psychological attack surface, to go after the population, to get them riled up. And frankly, the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, they're really not generating net new content. They're not creating divisions across the American people or elsewhere. They're taking existing divides or points of friction and just amplifying and playing both sides of the coin. And it's not just the US. We've seen that here in Europe. We just saw what happened with Romania's election, with foreign interference there as well. So it is not a threat that's going away. It will happen. There will be some degree of influence operation, at a minimum from Russia, in the German election. And it will be every other major election going forward. But it's not just elections, right? We're seeing the Russians on a daily basis undermine support of Ukraine. And it was a really interesting analysis when you look at the US election. As soon as the election was over, the next day, boom, all the activity that we were seeing from Russian-affiliated actors, the kind of successors of Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency, they all pivoted right back to the Ukrainian conflict. So they're nimble, they're flexible, they're adaptable, but they are absolutely active, and they will continue to be active going forward because they've seen the last decade the fact that not just can they get a reaction from the public, but they also see that the media loves covering this stuff, and it only further amplifies. And so when you actually measure what the real impact is, it's not from the operation itself, it's the reflections and the refractions.
Sticking with Russia, but pivoting to cybercrime for a second. So obviously we've seen very active cybercrime. Ransomware has been the top cyber threat for industry for, I believe, 2 or 3 years now. This is a clear and present threat to industries, to sectors, also to governments. We do have new reports now. We've got one report this week from Google that basically points out that the line between what we consider cybercrime and cybercriminal networks versus what we consider state-backed hacking groups, advanced persistent threat groups, etc., that line is increasingly blurring, and that in fact these are ecosystems that exchange tools, they exchange resources and capabilities. Do you agree with that assessment, and do you feel that that should be impacting how we respond to
I absolutely agree, and it was funny that on the prior panel, Christopher Alberg had mentioned that it's not a cybercrime problem, it's a Russian cybercrime problem. I think that's one way to look at it, but I do think that there's a broader set of threat actors that are now in the game because over the last 6, 7, 8 years, they've seen how profitable it can be. And there are groups even emerging out of the United States that have kind of graduated out of video game cheat code hacking and are now into cybercrime. At MGM Grand Casino in Las Vegas a couple years ago, there were a number of US and UK minors in some cases, and they have the advantage of, law enforcement doesn't always roll them up because they know they're minors and they're just gonna have to put them back on the street. So it is a truly a global scourge currently. And to your point, there is an increasingly blurry line between state actors and non-state actors, and particularly the way that taskings happen. So we had reports out of the UK's National Cybersecurity Center just a year and a half ago that suggested, or didn't suggest, flat out said, that Russian security services were giving direction on tasking objectives to cybercrime groups that they would subsequently go after. And our own research at Sentinel One suggests that Chinese state-affiliated actors are also now pivoting to ransomware in kind of a last mile cleanup effort. And it makes a lot of sense. You achieve your nation state objectives, you get the intelligence you want, you get the intellectual property you want, and then you make a little bit of extra money on the side. And I think that is in states where corruption is rife and where rule of law does not exist as robustly as it does in the West and in democracies, we will continue to see that play out. But the real issue here is that by the democratization of the internet and the fact that we've collapsed these geographic distances between us, and anyone on the other side of the earth can reach out and touch someone in Germany, in the US, or elsewhere, the barriers to entry are quite low, and the commodity level of tooling and capabilities are just hanging out there on the internet that anyone can go and buy.
What we've also seen is a much more active law enforcement community. The
Yes.
FBI has led a number of takedowns and crackdowns on the ransomware groups behind this technology. The technology itself is much more sharing of how to decrypt, for instance, how to respond to this threat. That's been a very active side of
Yes.
what FBI has been doing, what Europol has been coordinating in Europe. We're now seeing a change of leadership in the United States. How do you think that work is going to continue?
I think it will continue. And again, we just had Ann Neuberger up here, who in large part was the kinetic energy driver behind the counter-ransomware initiative that emerged after the Colonial Pipeline incident in the United States in 2021. By the way, fun little fact, the only time that President Biden met President Putin was the summer of 21 after the Colonial Pipeline incident. So ransomware led to the only meeting of the two as Biden was president. But nonetheless, the counter-ransomware initiative, I think, has staying power because it is truly a joint effort, where, in fact, the United States, if anything, was encouraging but not leading any of the various work streams. And so the various countries that are involved will continue to drive those efforts. And I think those joint operations have been effective. The Lockbit takedown, Lockbit was a large group that was disrupted last year, and in large part by the National Crime Agency in the UK. And it's efforts like those. The thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that there will not be a single fatal blow. This is a marathon. This is an ultra marathon. You are just chipping away constantly, disrupting them, taking their tools away from them, making them go develop new tools, breaking the trust between the groups themselves so that they're entirely online, but making sure that they might not know who the other person they thought was their ally or friend is not necessarily their ally or friend. That is all friction. That is all positive for defenders. And then the second piece is the deterrent side. We have a much different ransomware experience in the United States than you do here in Europe, particularly in the UK, where there are laws in many cases on paying the ransom. That is a meaningful deterrence measure. And in a lot of cases, the ransomware operators are not going after those targets because they know they're not going to get money. That does not exist in the US. And so it does drive whales. It drives bigger takedowns in bigger ransomware pots. So we do continue to see big activity in the US.
If I can ask you, one of the reasons why this doesn't exist in the US, or at least in some countries, is because when it comes to a hospital, you can't force a hospital not to pay a ransom if literally its systems are down and its patients are waiting to be operated. Do you think there is some
The
way
UK may disagree with you on that under the national health system, There is a proposal on the table that would limit the ability to pay ransom in some cases.
Do you believe it should be a blanket rule, or should there be exceptions to a certain?
It's likely not achievable or enforceable at the present. I think we need to aspire to a point where you can't pay ransom, but I also think we need to break down the conversation a little bit, because the way ransomware has evolved, it's not just about encrypting and locking up systems, it's also about stealing data and extorting. I think on the extortion side, the reason you pay, this is a generalized statement, but there are different reasons. One reason could be for regulatory purposes or otherwise. So we have to evaluate the tensions, evaluate the incentives for payment, and see what levers we can pull there to get in front of payments.
What I do want to get at is, we've been talking a lot about, I guess, what you could call sort of active or proactive responses. Another aspect is obviously the defense side and the element of resilience. How do we build resilience in our governments, in our industries, in our societies against these threats? There's been a lot of work on this, both in the United States as in Europe. I look at this from the European perspective. We cover European policy very closely, and there's been a regulatory drive, as we've seen in across the European Union, steps to regulate and thus force
Cyber Resilience Act, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the point that I want to get to is this has been quite a productive exchange, I feel, between the European agencies and their American counterparts in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of exchange, a lot of forums, and a lot of exchanging of industry practices of how do you handle resilience. Do you believe that will continue? Because the new administration clearly has a different view of what government agencies are supposed to do.
I think the vice president in Paris the other day was crystal clear in terms of the regulatory divide between across the Atlantic. I think the last administration made significant progress in working with industry to find the right regulatory levers to pull, streamline, make smarter regulations. It's not clear to me just yet what the current administration, the Trump administration, is going to do. However, I think if you follow the words they put on paper and their messaging, you're going to see deregulation, and that's going to be likely across the board, including cyber. And unfortunately, I think resilience, at least what I've seen in the US markets, resilience is a byproduct of stress. And stress comes in a couple different ways. One of those stressors is regulation. Another one of those stressors is actually having an incident, and you have to respond and get better for the next time. So we'll see what happens. I think we're probably going to enter a phase here of a few more incidents in the United States.
If we want to close with where we started, which is cybersecurity at the top of the political agenda, how do you express to leaders that will be speaking in just an hour or so at this security conference, just a couple of minutes away? How do you express to them the real threat of cybersecurity and cyber threat actors right now? What is the one thing you would tell a leader that gets on stage in a bit about what this actually impacts in their government?
China is preparing for war. The first trigger they're going to pull is cyber. Are we ready?
Great. Chris, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.